It whistled through the Black Hills and rolled across the Wyoming plains like a living thing. Cold, hollow, endless. It carried with it the dust of the dying year, the last cry of the buffalo, and the loneliness of men who had come west looking for freedom and found only silence. Benjamin Clay leaned forward in the saddle, the brim of his hat heavy with frost, his coat stiff with the weight of the storm. The horse beneath him, a gray gelding named Jesse, moved slow but steady through the drifts. Every hoofstep broke the frozen crust of snow with a muffled crack that sounded like bones giving way. The sky had been gray for days. The land was a wide white sheet of nothing, fences half buried, the creek frozen stiff, the cattle gone quiet. Winter in the territory wasn't just weather, it was a test of a man's spirit. And Ben Clay, after all he'd seen in life, wasn't sure how much of his was left. He had fought in the war between brothers. He had seen men die for flags and causes that didn't keep them warm at night. When it was over, he'd gone west, chasing the idea that there might be peace somewhere beyond the smoke. He found land and built a small ranch with his own hands, fences, a barn, and a cabin barely big enough for one. The neighbors said he didn't talk much. The truth was, Ben had forgotten how. That morning he'd ridden out to look for a missing heifer, one of the younger ones, a restless thing that wandered off during the night. He didn't expect to find her alive, not in weather like this. What he didn't expect to find at all was a child. He spotted the shape from 20 yards out, a small, uneven mound against the snow near a fallen pine. At first he thought it was an animal, maybe a coyote, or the carcass of a deer. But as he drew closer, he saw the dark braid of hair, the small hand, frozen stiff and curled against the body. His heart clenched. Ben swung down from the saddle and knelt beside the figure, a boy, 8, maybe 9 years old. His skin was dark, windburned. His lips cracked and blue. The animal hide around his shoulders was stiff with frost. His bare feet blackened from the cold. For a long moment, Ben just stared at him, unsure whether he was alive or already gone. Then he saw it, the faintest quiver beneath the boy's ribs. A heartbeat. Ben's jaw tightened. He pulled off his gloves, pressed his rough palm to the child's chest, and felt the weak thrum of life. God Almighty, he whispered under his breath. You're still breathing. The wind howled through the pines as if to answer him. Every thought told him to leave the boy. This was Lakota country and the land of the Sioux. The army had been fighting them for years. Every rancher, every settler, every man who'd lived through the raids carried his own stories of burned barns and missing families. Ben had seen enough killing for 10 lifetimes. He knew what harboring a native child could mean. But as he looked at the boy's small, frozen face, something inside him shifted. Something older than war, deeper than fear. He gathered the child into his arms, feeling how light he was, no heavier than a sack of grain. The boy's head fell against his chest, limp, silent. Ben swung into the saddle with the boy across his lap and turned the horse toward home. The wind was merciless. It tore at his coat, stung his eyes, and froze the sweat on the horse's neck. But Jesse kept on. The old gelding had pulled Ben through worse before. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was a dying glow behind the snow clouds. Ben took the boy straight into the barn. It was warmer there than the cabin. He laid him near the stove, stripped the wet hides, and rubbed his arms with burlap until the boy's skin began to pink again. He built the fire high and fed it like it was his own breath on the line. He spoke softly while he worked, though he wasn't sure why, maybe because silence had followed him too long. You're all right now, son, he muttered. You're safe. No one's gonna hurt you here. When the boy's eyelids fluttered open, Ben saw eyes as dark as river stones staring back at him, wild, scared, and ancient all at once. The child spoke a few words in Lakota, too soft for Ben to catch. The tone was pleading, uncertain. Ben wished for the first time in years that he could understand another man's language. Easy, he said quietly. You're gonna be fine. Just rest. He spooned broth into the boy's mouth, one trembling sip at a time. The boy coughed, then swallowed, and color crept slowly into his face. Ben sat back on his heels and exhaled a long, shaky breath. He didn't know who the boy was, didn't know what had happened to his family, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let him die out here. That night, Ben didn't sleep. He sat by the fire with his rifle across his knees, listening to the wind gnaw at the boards of the barn. Every creak sounded like footsteps. Every gust felt like a warning. But dawn came quiet. The first light spread thin and silver over the snow. Ben stepped outside to fetch water from the pump. The air was still, heavy, almost too still. And then he saw them. A dark line on the horizon. Riders. He blinked hard, thinking it might be the wind playing tricks on his eyes. But as the light grew, the shapes took form. 1, then 10, then 100. Warriors painted and armed, their horses moving in silence across the white plain. By the time the sun rose fully, 200 Lakota riders had formed a long, perfect line across the field in front of his barn. The air itself seemed to stop breathing. Ben Clay stood motionless, his hands cold, his heart heavy in his chest and inside the barn. The little boy he had saved, the one lying beneath his blankets, stirred in his sleep, whispering a single word that Ben couldn't understand. It was the moment before the storm, and Ben knew without a doubt that his act of mercy had changed everything. Ben Clay stood at the edge of his barn, the cold biting at his face, watching the line of Lakota warriors stretch across the valley like a shadow come to life. 200 strong, maybe more. Their horses pawed at the snow, snorting steam. The riders sat tall and silent, their faces painted in the colors of war and red, black, and white, their braids bound with feathers that fluttered in the wind. Not one of them moved. The silence was the kind that presses against a man's chest, makes him aware of every beat of his heart. Ben's fingers hovered near his rifle, but he didn't lift it. A single twitch could turn the quiet into bloodshed. He looked back toward the barn door, where the boy still slept wrapped in blankets near the fire. The child had survived the night. His breathing was stronger now, his face less pale. Ben thought of him lying there fragile as a bird's wing, while 200 armed men waited outside. He had seen war before, and we've seen lines like this, soldiers staring each other down in the dawn light, both sides afraid to make the first move. But this was different. These weren't men fighting for flags or nations. These were fathers, brothers, protectors of a people pushed to the edge of the world, and he, somehow, had stepped into their path. The leader rode forward. He was an older man, tall and broad-shouldered, his black hair streaked with gray. He wore a long buffalo robe and held a lance decorated with eagle feathers and beads that shimmered faintly, even in the weak sunlight. His horse was painted white with handprints along its flank. Every motion of the animal was calm and deliberate, as though both rider and horse knew their power didn't need to be shouted. Ben stood his ground as the man approached. When the rider was close enough, he stopped and looked down at Ben, a gaze steady and unreadable. The air between them was sharp and alive with tension. Neither spoke for a long moment. Finally, the warrior lifted his hand, palm open, and not in threat, but in greeting. Ben hesitated, then did the same. Another rider, younger, came forward from the line. His face bore the same bone structure as the boy's. He dismounted and stepped closer, his moccasins silent in the snow. He said something in Lakota, a long sentence, melodic and heavy with emotion. His voice cracked midway through. Ben shook his head slightly. "I don't understand you," he said quietly. "The boy, he was dying. I found him out in the snow. He gestured helplessly toward the barn. "I couldn't leave him." The young warrior stared hard at him, eyes filled with both suspicion and pain. He said another word, pointing to the barn. "Yes," Ben said. "He's inside. He's alive." The older warrior's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened. He dismounted slowly, the beads in his hair clicking softly as they moved. He handed his spear to one of his men and walked toward the barn with a solemn dignity that made Ben's pulse quicken. Ben followed him. Inside, the air was warmer. The smell of smoke and hay mixed with the faint sweetness of broth simmering on the stove. The boy stirred as they entered, blinking against the light. When he saw the older man, his eyes went wide and then filled with tears. He whispered a word, soft and trembling. The warrior's face broke, the years and lines giving way to raw, wordless relief. He crossed the space in 2 long strides, dropped to his knees beside the child and took the boy's hand in both of his. He didn't speak, didn't need to. The emotion in the air was louder than any words could have been. Ben stood back, feeling suddenly like a stranger in his own barn. The young warrior came in next. He knelt beside the older man, his shoulders shaking. Ben realized then, the resemblance wasn't just imagination. The boy was their kin. Family. Maybe the chief's son or grandson. The boy whispered again, and the older man nodded slowly, his eyes turning toward Ben. There was no hatred there now, only something deeper. Gratitude, maybe. Or the painful understanding that two men who should have been enemies had met at the fragile crossroads between life and death. The older warrior rose to his feet and faced Ben. "You," he said carefully. The word came rough like a stone rolling from his throat. Then he placed his hand over his heart. "Taksha ake," he said softly, a phrase Ben didn't know. The tone was warm, respectful. Ben nodded. "You're welcome," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure what the right thing to say was. The warriors outside hadn't moved. They waited in complete silence, the snow falling heavier now, muffling the sound of the world. Ben stepped outside again, heart still pounding. He looked at the long line of riders, men who could have destroyed his ranch in a heartbeat, but none made a move toward him. Instead, several dismounted and began lighting fires in the snow, their movement slow, deliberate, peaceful. The older warrior stepped out beside him. "Boy, my blood," he said haltingly, tapping his chest. "You good man." Ben just stared for a moment. "He's your grandson?" The warrior didn't answer, but his expression told him all he needed to know. The next hour passed like a dream. Some of the warriors tended to the boy, wrapping him in warm hides and singing under their breath. Others offered Ben food and dried meat, smoked buffalo. No one raised a weapon. No one spoke above a whisper. Ben watched them with a quiet awe. He had grown up hearing tales about savage tribes, about raids and massacres, about how Indians couldn't be trusted. But here in his own barn, he saw tenderness, devotion, family. The boy slept again, breathing deep. The old chief, for that was surely what he was, stood over him like a sentinel. As the snow thickened, the warriors made camp around Ben's property, their fires glowing like stars scattered across the field. The silence of the plains was gone now, replaced by the low hum of Lakota songs, ancient and sad and strong. Ben stood at his fence, staring out into the night. He realized then that he had crossed a line that no map or treaty could draw. And though he didn't know what would come next, whether these men would ride away in peace or whether the army would come looking for trouble when they learned who had been here, he knew one thing for certain. His act of mercy had bound him to something greater than himself. The wind shifted, the fires burned brighter, and somewhere behind him, the little boy began to whisper in his sleep. Words Ben couldn't understand, but somehow felt were meant for him. The fire in the barn had burned low, its light painting the walls in shades of amber and shadow. Ben Clay sat on an overturned bucket near the boy's bedroll, elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tight together as if holding something fragile and invisible. Outside, the voices of the Lakota men drifted through the night, low, rhythmic chants that seemed to blend with the whisper of the wind. It was a sound he had never heard before. It wasn't loud or threatening. It was something older, something that felt like it belonged to the land itself. It rolled through the plains like prayer. The boy, whose name Ben had learned was Tane, slept peacefully now. His breathing was slow and strong, his small hands tucked beneath his chin. Each time the boy stirred, Ben felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had brought men back from battlefields. He had seen death so close he could smell it. But he had never felt this kind of weight, the fragile, trembling responsibility of saving a single innocent life. Behind him, the door creaked open. The old Lakota chief, Atane's grandfather, stepped inside, ducking beneath the low frame. His heavy buffalo robe brushed the straw-covered floor. Ben stood out of respect, unsure of what gesture to make. He still couldn't tell if he was considered a friend or a tolerated stranger. The old man nodded toward the sleeping child, then toward Ben. "Boy, you save," he said, his accent thick but his meaning clear. Ben nodded slowly. "I couldn't just leave him out there." The old chief studied him for a long moment, his eyes sharp but not cruel. There was an understanding in that silence, the kind that passes between men who have both buried too much of their past. Finally, the old man pointed to himself. "Red Hawk," he said, then touching his hand to Ben's chest. "You?" "Ben," he replied. "Ben Clay." Red Hawk repeated it quietly, shaping the strange sound with care. Then he reached out, clasped Ben's shoulder, and gave a small nod that felt heavier than any words could have. Ben had spent years thinking of the West as divided. White ranchers on one side, natives on the other, both fighting over land neither truly owned. But standing there with this proud, silent man beside him, he began to see something different. Both were bound to the same earth. Both lived under the same cruel skies. Both knew loss. As dawn crept in through the cracks of the barn wall, Red Hawk's men began to move. The warriors packed their fires, brushed snow from their horses, and spoke quietly among themselves. Ben watched from the doorway, unsure what their plans were. When the boy awoke, his first sight was of his grandfather. His eyes lit up, and for the first time Ben heard him laugh. A small, broken laugh that cracked the cold silence like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Red Hawk knelt beside him, his voice a soft rumble as he spoke words Ben couldn't understand. The boy clutched his grandfather's arm tightly and then, turning, looked up at Ben. He said something, slow. Careful? Ben frowned, not understanding, but the boy tried again, pressing his tiny hand to his heart. Ben, he said, then touched his chest again. Friend. Ben felt his throat tighten. He crouched down beside him and nodded. Yeah, kid, he said softly. Friends. Red Hawk smiled, not wide but deep, a gesture of true approval. The morning passed without tension. Some of the warriors helped mend Ben's fence, which had collapsed under the weight of snow. Others drew water from the frozen creek. Ben watched them work with the quiet rhythm of men who knew how to survive in a land that showed no mercy. They were graceful, efficient, connected to everything they touched. Around noon, Ben noticed one of the younger braves watching him closely, a tall man with sharp eyes and a single feather tied into his braid. He approached slowly, then pointed toward the rifle leaning against the barn wall. Ben hesitated. The man spoke, then mimed aiming a gun, firing it, and missing, his grin teasing, boyish. Ben chuckled despite himself. You want to see how it's done? He asked. He lifted the rifle, checked the chamber, and pointed toward a half-frozen fence post at the far edge of the field. With one clean motion, he fired. The shot cracked through the cold air, splintering the post clean in half. The young warrior whistled softly, impressed. Then he gestured for Ben to hand him the rifle. Ben did, though with a flicker of hesitation. The man studied the weapon carefully, then raised it to his shoulder. He took his time, breathing deep, eyes narrowing. The next shot struck the remains of the post dead center. Ben laughed. Guess you didn't need my lesson after all. The warrior grinned wide. Good, he said simply, his English awkward but proud. But peace, he knew, was fragile in this country. By afternoon, Red Hawk's demeanor had changed. He spoke urgently with his men, their tones hushed but serious. The warriors began saddling their horses again, tightening straps and securing weapons. The easy calm of the morning slipped away like smoke in the wind. Ben approached him carefully. What's going on? Red Hawk turned to face him. His eyes were steady, but there was a storm behind them. Soldiers, he said simply. Come, Ben froze. The army? Red Hawk nodded once. White men? Coming fast. Big noise. Ben's heart sank. He understood what that meant. Somewhere, word must have reached Fort Reno that a group of Lakota were camped near a settler's land. To the army, that meant one thing, an attack waiting to happen. The old chief's voice dropped low. We go soon. No fight. Ben's jaw tightened. You shouldn't have to run. Red Hawk looked at him, long and hard. Fight no good. Boy need peace. It was the kind of wisdom that came from a man who'd buried too many of his people. The warriors mounted their horses one by one. Tani was wrapped tightly in a hide, sitting in front of his grandfather. Before they left, the boy reached out to Ben and pressed a small carved figure into his palm. A tiny horse made from bone, smooth and warm from his touch. Ben looked down at it. Speechless, friend, the boy said again, voice barely a whisper. Then, with a shout from Red Hawk, the warriors turned and rode north, a thunder of hooves fading into the snowy horizon. When the last rider disappeared, Ben stood alone in the field, the cold wind cutting across the plains once more. He stared at the small horse in his hand. It was the only proof that what had happened here, the kindness, the miracle, the moment between two worlds, was real. But deep down, Ben Clay knew this wasn't the end of the story, because men like Red Hawk didn't flee without reason, and the army didn't ride without orders. Something was coming. The snow never really stopped that winter. It came in slow, steady drifts that blanketed the plains and made everything look pure, clean, peaceful. But Ben Clay had lived long enough to know that snow could hide anything. Beneath that white, quiet world lay bones, secrets and sins that time would never wash away. For 2 days after Red Hawk and his people rode north, Ben's ranch stood silent again. The campfires were gone. The hoofprints had filled with fresh snow. If a stranger had come upon the place, they'd never have known that 200 Lakota warriors had once been there. But Ben knew. He could still feel the weight of their presence. Their songs carried on the wind, the boys' laughter echoing faintly in his memory. Every time he looked at the small carved horse sitting on the mantel, he felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt since before the war. Hope. He thought often about Tane, that fragile, brave boy whose will to live had been stronger than the storm that tried to claim him. Ben wondered where they were now. Were they safe? Had the soldiers already found them? The thought gnawed at him like hunger. On the morning of the third day, as the sun struggled weakly through the clouds, Ben heard it, the distant thunder of horses. Not wild mustangs this time, too uniform, too deliberate. Soldiers. He stepped out of the barn and shaded his eyes against the pale light. Across the ridge, dark figures moved through the snow. A column of riders, rifles slung, the blue of their coats faint beneath the frost. The U.S. cavalry. Ben's jaw tightened. He'd seen that same formation once before, years ago, when he'd been on the wrong side of a hill in Tennessee. That same rigid order, that same false sense of righteousness. He didn't move until they were close enough to see his breath. "Mr. Clay," the lead rider called, his voice sharp and practiced. "Benjamin Clay, this your property?" Ben nodded once. "It is." The man rode forward, tall and stern, the kind of officer who measured his worth by how many men obeyed his voice. His uniform was clean despite the mud. His boots polished, his pistol gleaming in the weak sun. His nameplate read Captain Merritt. "We're with the 7th Cavalry," he said. "Fort Reno Detachment. Reports say a large band of Sioux were sighted near this location. You seen anything unusual?" Ben's stomach knotted. He looked past the captain to the 30 men behind him, rifles across their laps, eyes scanning the horizon. Their faces were young, pale, cold, and eager. He knew that look. They were searching for something to kill. "Nothing unusual," Ben said evenly. "Just snow and cattle." Merritt narrowed his eyes. "You're saying you didn't see them?" "A large group, 200, maybe more, came through this area." Ben shook his head. "Haven't seen anyone for weeks." A murmur ran through the ranks. The captain's lips twitched into something between a smirk and a warning. "You'd better be sure of that, Mr. Clay," he said, "because harboring hostiles is a hanging offense." Ben didn't flinch. "There's no one here but me." The captain dismounted, boots crunching in the snow. He walked past Ben toward the barn, eyes scanning everything with suspicion. The fire pit, the half-empty broth pot, the blankets stacked in the corner. "Mind if we look around?" Merritt asked, though he didn't wait for an answer. Ben followed, silent. The soldiers spread out, some checking the hayloft, others peering behind the stalls. One of them lifted the small carved horse from the mantel and turned it in his fingers. "Sir," the soldier said, "this ain't white man's work." Merritt took the carving, studying it for a long moment. "Where'd you get this, Clay?" Ben's mind raced. He could almost hear Tane's voice again, the small whisper of the word friend. His throat tightened, but he forced himself to stay steady. "Traded for it," he said finally. "Trappers come through sometimes. They sell all kinds of junk." The captain stared at him, unblinking. "You're lying." Ben met his gaze. "And you're trespassing." The barn went quiet. A dozen soldiers turned toward the exchange, hands resting on their rifles. The air was thick, not with sound, but with the kind of silence that breaks just before a gunshot. Finally, Merritt laughed, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You've got guts, Clay. I'll give you that." He tossed the carving back onto the shelf. "But don't play dumb with me. Those savages came through here. You might think helping them makes you noble, but it makes you an enemy of the United States Army." Ben stepped forward, close enough that the captain could see the years carved into his face. "I fought for the United States Army," Ben said quietly. "I bled for it, but I don't owe it my soul." The captain's smile vanished. "Careful," he said coldly. "You're not in uniform anymore." He turned to his men. "We'll make camp here. Search the property. Every inch." The soldiers moved quickly. They tore through the barn, overturned feed barrels, and dug through the snow behind the fences. Ben stood by the doorway, jaw locked, fists tight, every muscle in his body coiled. He could feel the humiliation burning in his chest. By sunset, they'd found nothing. No tracks, no evidence. Red Hawk and his people had vanished like ghosts. The captain mounted his horse again. "If I find out you lied to me, Clay," he said, "I'll be back with 50 men and you'll swing for treason." Ben didn't answer. The column rode off slowly, their flags snapping in the cold wind. When the sound of hooves faded, Ben stood alone again, surrounded by the wreckage of his own barn. The fire had gone out. The snow began to fall again, heavier this time, soft flakes drifting down like ash after a battle. He reached for the small carving on the shelf and held it tight in his fist. He had chosen mercy over fear, and now he knew what it might cost him. The war he thought he'd left behind was coming back to find him, and this time, he wouldn't be fighting for a country. He'd be fighting for the truth. The storm rolled in before dawn, thick, relentless, a white wall that swallowed the horizon and buried every sound. Snow piled against the cabin door crept under the shutters and blanketed the barn roof until the whole world seemed to disappear under its weight. Ben Clay woke to the howling wind and the uneasy silence beneath it. Something felt wrong. The kind of wrong that didn't have a shape or a name, just a presence. He rose from his cot, lit the lantern, and pulled on his coat. Jesse, his old horse, shifted nervously in the stall as Ben stepped into the barn. The animal's breath steamed in the cold, eyes rolling toward the door. "Easy, boy," Ben murmured, running a hand along the horse's neck. "It's just the wind." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. He grabbed his rifle and stepped outside. The storm bit into him, stinging his face, stealing his breath. The sky was low, gray, and heavy. He couldn't see more than a dozen yards ahead. Still, he knew something, or someone, was out there. The army's visit had changed everything. Since the soldiers had ridden off 2 days ago, Ben had kept his rifle loaded and his saddle ready. He didn't trust men like Captain Merritt, men who wore law like armor but used it as a weapon. He knew they'd be back, maybe not for him but for the ones he'd protected, and if the soldiers found Red Hawk's people, there would be blood. He couldn't sit still with that thought. By noon, the snow eased just enough for him to saddle Jesse and ride out toward the ridge. The air was sharp and still, every sound magnified. His eyes scanned the plains for any sign of movement, smoke, tracks, anything. But all he saw was the endless white stretch of winter. Then halfway down the ravine, he found it. Blood. A thin, frozen trail of it streaked across the snow, winding toward the creek bed. Ben dismounted and crouched low. The snow had crusted around the stains, but the shape was unmistakable, drag marks, hoof prints, and the outline of moccasins. He followed the trail carefully, heart pounding harder with each step. As he neared the creek, the smell hit him, metallic and heavy. Death. 3 bodies lay half buried in the snow. Lakota warriors. Ben knelt beside them. One was barely older than a boy. Another had his hand clenched around a broken bow. The third, his chest still and eyes open to the gray sky, had an eagle feather frozen into his braid. They hadn't died in battle. They'd been hunted. Ben's stomach turned. He could see the bullet wounds, the direction of the tracks, soldiers' horses moving fast. He closed the fallen men's eyes with his gloved hand. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Then he saw movement, faint, almost imperceptible. In the hollow beneath a fallen log, someone stirred. Ben rushed forward and pulled aside a layer of snow. Beneath it was a woman, a Lakota, her hair tangled, her face pale with frost. Her arm was wrapped protectively around a bundle of hides. When Ben lifted the corner of the hide, his breath caught. Inside was Tane. The boy's eyes were closed, his lips blue, his breathing shallow but there. Alive. "Tane," Ben murmured. "God Almighty." The woman stirred weakly, whispering in Lakota. Ben didn't understand, but her voice, low, trembling, carried a plea he could feel in his bones. "You're safe," he said gently. "You're safe now. I've got you both." He carried the boy first, then came back for the woman, laying her across Jesse's back. The wind began to howl again, the snow thickening. Every step home felt like pushing against the entire weight of the world. By the time they reached the barn, the woman was barely conscious. Ben set her by the fire, rubbing warmth into her arms, giving her sips of hot water. She looked at him through half-lidded eyes and whispered something again. A name, soft and desperate. "Red Hawk," Ben repeated. "You're looking for Red Hawk." She nodded faintly, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. Ben sat back, feeling the heaviness of her grief before she could even speak it. She didn't need to tell him what had happened. He already knew. The soldiers had found them. As night fell, the wind eased, but the silence grew unbearable. The woman, Red Hawk's daughter, Ben guessed, slept fitfully, clutching the boy close. Tani's breathing steadied. Ben stared into the fire, anger and sorrow burning together inside him. He had fought wars before, but this one felt different. It wasn't fought for glory or cause. It was cruelty, the kind that came from fear, ignorance, and pride. When dawn broke, the woman woke and tried to stand. She looked weak but determined. Ben helped her to the door and she pointed north, her voice faint. "They take him," she said. "Red Hawk." Ben's blood ran cold. "The soldiers took him?" She nodded once, tears freezing on her cheeks. That single truth hit Ben like a hammer. Red Hawk, the man who had called him friend, who had trusted him with his grandson, was now a prisoner of the same men who'd threatened to hang Ben for showing mercy. Ben turned to the boy, still asleep by the fire. He felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him like the winter sky. He could stay, keep his head down, and let the world go on burning itself to ash. Or he could ride out and face the kind of fight no man walked away from. He ran his thumb over the small bone carving. The horse Tane had given him. "Friend," the boy had said. Ben's jaw tightened. He knew what he had to do. He strapped on his gun belt, packed ammunition, and saddled Jessie. The woman watched him quietly, understanding without needing words. As he mounted his horse, he looked back one last time at the barn, the firelight flickering against the wood. The boy sleeping soundly inside. "I'll bring him back," Ben said. "I swear it." The woman nodded, pressing her hand to her heart. Then he turned toward the north, where the army had gone, and rode into the frozen wilderness. The wind rose again, and with it came the faint, haunting sound of drums, Lakota war songs carried by the storm. Ben Clay didn't know if he'd live to see the next sunrise, but he knew one thing with certainty. This time, he was riding not for a flag, not for land, not for himself, but for the man who had called him brother. The sky was the color of lead when Ben Clay rode north. The wind had quieted, but the world still felt heavy, smothered under a silence too deep to be natural. It was the kind of silence that made a man listen to his own heartbeat and wonder how many more he had left. The snow crunched beneath Jesse's hooves as the horse pushed through the drifts. Ben's coat was stiff with frost, his breath forming clouds that drifted past his face like ghosts. His rifle hung across his back, his revolver tied low at his hip, and inside his coat pocket was the small carved horse, the token of friendship that had started it all. The journey to Fort Reno took him 2 days. He didn't stop except to water the horse and melt a handful of snow for food. Sleep came in moments, shallow, haunted. He dreamed of fire, drums, and the boy's voice whispering the word friend again and again, fading into the wind. On the third morning, when the horizon began to glow faintly gold, he saw it, the fort. It rose from the plains like a scar, a square of stone and timber surrounded by a trench, its flag whipping hard in the icy wind. Smoke drifted from the chimneys and the faint clang of iron echoed from inside. Soldiers moved along the walls like clockwork, rifles glinting in the pale light. Ben reined in his horse on the ridge and studied the place. He could see the stables, the barracks, and, near the western edge, a row of crude wooden pens. Cages. There, among the shadows, he saw movement. Men sitting in the snow, bound and silent. Lakota. His stomach twisted when he saw Red Hawk. The old chief was seated against a post, hands tied behind his back, his head bowed. Even from that distance, Ben could feel the weight of his dignity, unbroken, unbent. Around him, soldiers lounged with rifles resting across their knees, laughing, passing a bottle. Ben's grip on the reins tightened until his knuckles turned white. He'd seen cruelty before. He'd seen the war chew men up and spit them out. But this was something different. This wasn't war. This was pride dressed up as justice. He turned Jesse around and rode west out of sight. By dusk, he had circled the fort completely, noting every post, every guard, every gate. He had no plan, no backup, no allies. But he had one purpose. Red Hawk had saved his life by sparing it. Now it was Ben's turn to repay the debt. As night fell, he crouched in the snow just beyond the perimeter. The moon broke through the clouds, casting a cold silver light across the plains. He could hear the sentries talking above him, their laughter carried by the wind. Can't believe they caught that old savage alive, one of them said. The captain's gonna have his fun with him tomorrow, another replied. Says they're marching him to Cheyenne for hanging. Ben felt his stomach twist. Tomorrow. He waited until the guards moved off, then slipped closer. His boots made no sound in the snow. He kept low, his movement slow and steady like an old predator stalking prey. He reached the back wall and rough logs stacked high, and found a narrow section where the wood had split from the frost. He worked his knife in between, prying quietly until the logs gave way enough to slip through. The inside of the fort smelled of smoke and sweat. The soldiers were drunk, their laughter echoing from the mess hall. Only a few sentries remained near the holding pen, stamping their feet against the cold. Ben moved like a shadow. He crouched behind a wagon, waiting for the wind to rise. When it did, he sprinted across the open ground, snow crunching under his boots. Red Hawk lifted his head as Ben dropped beside him. For a moment, the old chief just stared, disbelief softening his hard eyes. Ben, he whispered, voice hoarse. You come. I'm getting you out, Ben said quietly. Where's the key? Red Hawk tilted his chin toward one of the guards, a young soldier leaning against the fence, rifle slung lazily across his shoulder.